Good morning, modern world. This is Mr. Aguilar. I'm going to give you a brief on what you're going to be doing today. So I'm gone because of Army stuff, but you can still get done what we were going to get done. Here's a picture of what your worksheet is going to look like. It's going to be in your Google Classroom, so make sure you're there. And then the slides here will be the little brief. The main part I'm going to help you with is just to kind of explain the directions, do the brief for you real quick, and then at the end you're going to have some time to watch the video and answer some of the questions. So here we go. Here's the actual slideshow that will guide your learning. As you can see at the first part of the worksheet, there's a summary of the Iraq War where you summarize Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, and Phase 4. Now these are a bit artificial. I chunked it up for you to make it a little bit more comprehensible, the distinct parts of the Iraq War and how that's going to lead to the rise of a terrorist group known as ISIS, which you're going to watch a video which explains them. So here we go. So the Iraq War, the early phases of the war is what you mostly know about. We've talked a lot about the invasion into Iraq for the various reasons, right? The U.S. invades Iraq. It's the UN doesn't agree, but the U.S. and others do it anyways, and they defeat Saddam Hussein's army in pretty quick fashion. The actual military, like defeating the Iraqi army, which was the fifth biggest at the time, happened at a rapid pace. It was only like 2-3 months until the U.S. was able, and the UK and other partners were able to defeat the Iraqi army. So that's good, but now the US has a country that doesn't have leadership because they just opposed all the leadership. So phase 2 rebuilding, the US spends a long time, not that long, like 3 years I guess, but they attempt to physically and politically rebuild Iraq. They give the power back to the Iraqi people. As we saw in the video last class, there were some controversies with that, right? That representative democracy, a lot of the people in Iraq were not super happy with that, and a lot of the rules and the documents and the laws that the U.S. heavily influenced the creation of. Also, many people are not happy with the trial of Saddam Hussein. The U.S. decides to execute Saddam Hussein. Well, I guess technically the Iraqi people decided that, but that's, again, how much the U.S. tampered with that trial is also debatable. This phase also has a lot of the rebuilding of a lot of Iraqi infrastructure because the U.S. bombed a lot of it and a lot of it was just destroyed in the fight. And then that continued search for WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. However, none of those are able to be found. So as we can see with our little pictures, the rapid pace of the Iraq invasion is right here from a cool website where you could click on things, which I thought was cool. The Saddam trial, like I said, it was kind of like the O.J. Simpson, like just like not just O.J. Simpson, but any of those trials, but like a very dramatic version of it. We see the former leader of our country get accused for many crimes, and he tries to defend himself, but it ends in his execution. And then famously, his statue that represents his rule is toppled in the early part of the Iraq War. So quickly defeat the army, try to rebuild the country physically and politically, but some things get in the way. In 2006 to 2008, this is what's known as the surge. As we're trying to rebuild Iraq, a lot of instability starts to flood into the country. Without the previous leadership, Iraq is having a hard time governing itself. Yes, the U.S. is trying to help, but it's still a difficult situation. Additionally, there's a lot of mistrust, as we saw in the last video, due to some of the methods that the United States utilized to try to rebuild their country. A lot of cultural misunderstandings between the two parties, such as that mosque incident where the U.S. U.S. soldiers ransacked a mosque. Yes, the leader of the mosque was teaching the people how to build bombs to attack the Americans, and the U.S. found those bombs, but the U.S. nonetheless still destroyed a lot of the holy texts, the Quran and other holy relics in there. So there's just mutual distrust and dislike on both sides. This kind of creates the perfect breeding ground for terrorism, which we're going to see in the video today. Al-Qaeda, the group that did do 9/11, flood in from all around the world into Iraq because they say, hey, wow, there's a huge concentration of U.S. troops. That's exactly what we want. We want to kill them to create a state of terror to make the U.S. leave. It's kind of exactly what they do. However, initially, the U.S. does send in 20,000 additional troops, which is known as the surge, to kind of handle this situation of this massive amount of unrest. And a lot of these groups kind of come from Al Qaeda does it, but a lot of these groups that are very anti-American who do ally with Al Qaeda to a certain extent come from Western Iraq, the less populated region, and the surge is really where the start of a huge civil war in Iraq occurs. Those who want the support of the U.S. and are willing to work with the U.S. U.S. people who propped up these politicians who are supposed to control Iraq, and those who want nothing to do with the United States. And Iraq really descends into that civil war, which leads to even greater instability, and that's why Al Qaeda comes in to try to conduct some terrorism against the United States and supporters of the U.S. in the Middle East. Then, after the situation does die down a little bit, the 20,000 additional troops do handle the situation somewhat. A little bit more peace and more stability is able to be brought to Iraq. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's a lot better than it was in 2006, I guess. The new president, President Obama, one of his campaign promises was, hey, I'm going to bring the troops home because we're tired of spending a lot of money and a lot of lives on this war. Because, yeah, that's what he was saying. So he gets elected, and the last U.S. military soldiers do indeed leave Iraq in December 2011. As we can see in this chart here, we can see U.S. troop numbers in Iraq. We can see the surge begin, and we can see that number rise significantly when the surge begins. And then when President Obama is elected, we can see it start to decline and eventually fall off towards the end of 2011. Here we can see Iraqi civilian deaths. So all the while, it's important to note that the surge, where the Iraqi civil war began, and the U.S. sent more troops to handle the situation, is where a lot of Iraqi civilian deaths occur. However, as we can see, the situation is normalized, less civilian deaths towards the end, and the U.S. is starting to pull troops out in 2010 and then finish the job in 2011. Finish the job being pull troops out, not, make sure that Iraq is totally okay. Additionally, before we watch this documentary, because the documentary is going to kind of leave off at that point, as a reminder, Iraq is a majority Shia population type of Islam, but Saddam was a Sunni. So when he's in charge, it's really the Sunni elite who are going to be in charge, and the Shia are not going to have posts of power. Whereas Maliki, the prime minister of Iraq when the U.S. left in 2011, a central figure of the documentary, is going to be Shia, and you're going to see him kind of reverse the oppression that Saddam did. So whereas when Saddam was in charge, the Sunnis oppressed the Shias, Maliki, who's a Shia, is going to kind of get vengeance and oppress the Sunni. An initial religious, or ethnic piece of importance is that the Kurdish people, who we referred to a lot in the previous presentation, I just wanted to remind you, is a specific ethnic population in the northern portion of the country, and they see themselves as distinctly different from Iraq, and they even want their own country. So, yep, that's that. Some key terms in the video are going to be power vacuum. That's when someone in a place of power has lost control of a region and no one has replaced them. So a power vacuum existed when the United States overthrew Saddam Hussein, and the United States attempted to fill that power vacuum by creating new Iraqi leadership and have them as politicians. But it's a little bit hard to follow up on an act where someone is kind of in charge of the country. You kind of have to establish that legitimacy yourself. We'll see that be a bit of an issue in our documentary we're going to watch. Next up, we have the Syrian Civil War. The documentary does talk about it, but I wanted to give you some background information. Essentially, something known as the Arab Spring happens in 2011, where a lot of areas in the Arab world want to modernize, I guess, and democratize. So there's a lot of protests in many northern African countries and Middle Eastern countries, mostly in areas where basically dictators or kings or something have been in charge for decade plus long. Some of these places, the protests are put down somewhat peacefully. Some of these places, protests happen, but the leaders write it out and they stay in charge. But then in some places, the protests are put down not peacefully, such as in a nation known as Syria, or Iraq's western neighbor. The leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, does kill peaceful protesters. He has some of his soldiers and police shoot into the crowd, killing protesters who are angry that he's been in charge forever. and this starts a complex civil war in Syria that I'm not really going to get into, but just know, and the video will show you, that there's a lot of instability in Syria, as well as there's a civil war going on right next to Iraq, where they just finished a civil war. So a lot of instability in this little region south of Turkey. And then as a reminder, Ba'athist, that's the ideology and political party of Saddam Hussein and those who were loyal to him during his time in charge. And it's that pan-Arabic ideology, that idea that, hey, the Arab world should unite into one big country led by a caliph to create the new caliphate. But yeah, that's about it. After you listen to this little thing, this little spiel I gave you, and took notes on phases 1, 2, 3, 4, and the geography/ethnic differences of Iraq, and listed those key terms right here to make sure you have an understanding, you're just going to watch the video and answer the questions. This is in order. You don't have enough time to finish it, but I do expect you to finish about 20 to 30 minutes of the video, and then we'll pick up from there. Thanks for your time. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye for now.